We now have Caitlin Herrington from Harvest Plus, who's going to talk about country prioritization for biofortified crop interventions across Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
So as we know, resources are in fact not infinite. It's something that we're all faced with, and in that decision making, Harvest Plus is no different from you all. But when we are trying to decide where exactly to invest in biofortification, we're often met with three specific questions. The first is where. Where exactly throughout the world are the countries who identify as potential for biofortification interventions? The second is which crops do we invest in within those countries? And finally, among those countries that present themselves as potential countries for biofortification interventions, what's the priority among them? To help us address these questions, there are three main conditions that need to be met for biofortification interventions to work. The first is that the country needs to produce a crop. Not a shocker, right? The second is that the country needs to consume much of that crop on a per capita basis, meaning that they cannot export a large percentage of that portion of that production. And finally, the country needs to have a high level of micronutrient deficiency for the micronutrient to which the crop can be enriched. Each of these conditions builds into a sub-index for the tool that's been developed that we call at Harvest Plus the Biofortification Priority Index, or the BPI for short. The BPI was originally developed in 2013, and we've just undergone some updates, revisions, and so forth this past winter and spring. With this update and revised version of the BPI, we have added 11 micronutrient crop combinations. We've updated the methodology a bit, and we've also made sure to include, instead of just 1 year of data, an average of 3 years to smooth across any type of shocks that a country may be presented with. So the BPI score is a geometric mean. This is done so that each sub-index is accounted for as to complement and rather not substitute for one another. As I mentioned, they're all essential for biofortification to work in a country. 120 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America were gathered for this BPI update, and across these 18 crop micronutrient combinations, the scores that were developed for each of the countries was divided into quintiles, the top quintile being given top priority. Here's a quick overview of the methodology and data that went into BPI. I won't go into many of the details. I will mention that all the data, secondary data, national level, FALStat was the basis for most of the data gathering. And we used 3-year average for 2013, 12, and 11, which was the most recent data available across food balance sheet, production, and trade data, making sure that everything matched within the same year. For the production sub-index, 3 variables, 3 indicators were utilized. For the consumption sub-index, 2 indicators were utilized. I will note here consumption per capita. That's what the economists refer to it, though the nutritionists do account this as food availability from FALStat. And then for each sub-index for micronutrient deficiency, it's made up of 2 indicators. So here are the results in the table for top-ranking countries per crop micronutrient combination. I'm not sure on the large screen if you can tell what's in red or not, but the countries in Africa are highlighted in red. As you can see, of the 18 micronutrient crop combinations, 14 are in Africa. So it just goes to show that there's quite a great potential for biofortified crop interventions in Africa. We are working right now to map all of this data, so I'll share with you a few maps that we've developed thus far with our communications and knowledge management team. So here's a map for vitamin A maize. The countries which are in red are the ones that are top priority. So you can see that it is in fact concentrated in Africa. Mexico is not to be forgotten as well, though. For iron beans, the story is a bit mixed across the world, so countries pop up as top priority in Africa, Latin America, as well as Asia. and scattered throughout. And if you recall from the previous table, Burundi was the top ranking country. That's a change from BPI 1.0. So we did see a few changes from 1.0 to 2.0. No drastic changes, shifts a bit in, say, movement from the 5th spot to the 1st or so forth. And then here's the picture for zinc rice. So we see a shift from Africa to Asia for priority for the introduction of zinc rice. However, West Africa is still in there as potential top priority investments. While we're in Ghana, I thought it would be important to look at what the rankings were for Ghana. As I mentioned, we're still mapping all of this, so it's not an exhaustive list up there for the crop micronutrient combinations for Ghana, but 5 of them do in fact rank as top priority for Ghana. So vitamin A cassava, vitamin A maize, iron pearl millet, vitamin A sweet potatoes, and iron beans. And to date, vitamin A maize and orange flesh sweet potatoes are being delivered in Ghana. It is important to note what I have shared with you so far is the unweighted BPI. The BPI does have the ability to be weighted based on area and then also population if a stakeholder has a particular interest. Say if a seed company is interested in prioritizing maize and they're interested in looking at or working in countries that have the largest percentage of maize land cultivated amongst the 128 crops, 128 countries included in BPI. Or for instance, if population is a key metric which a stakeholder wants to use, prioritizing the Harvest Plus target population of women of childbearing age or children under 5 living in rural areas. So we do see in this table that the results, I just pulled an example of 3 of the crop micronutrient combinations, but it does shift around a bit between unweighted to area weighted versus population weighted. So while BPI really does pull together a lot of secondary data to help inform decision-making for Harvest Plus and its partners, it is important to note that it is not the only tool that should be used for decision-making. There are limitations with the BPI that have not been incorporated, and so I urge people to think about this when they are looking at these results to weigh it alongside other tangible or either non-tangible indicators that may come into the decision-making process. Thank you. There we go. Thanks.